Hi guys, welcome back. I have a little project here. This is a project for the State of the Union address and GDP growth in the US. So in this project, you're going to generate sentiment scores for State of the Union addresses, which are given every year. And you're going to plot those sentiment scores with economic growth, GDP growth in the US. And this is GDP growth in the previous year because the State of the Union addresses are given at the beginning of the year, January, February, sometimes March, April, and the president gives the address and he is speaking on economic conditions in the previous year. So in this project, I generate sentiment scores with some different modules. Specifically, we look at text blob and AFIN. And these modules are going to generate sentiment scores for us. So click the link in the description for this collab. And this one, we're not using any external files. We're just using the websites, the URLs, to generate our sentiment scores. So let's go ahead and hit the play button here. If you look at some of these modules, they should look familiar. We have beautiful soup, URL lib request. This is to grab the URLs, NumPy, pandas, matplotlib, that will help us with the plot. And then NLTK for cleaning the text. The next block, we have the URL list. So I put all of the URLs into a list, and this is really convenient for generating sentiment scores because we can easily use a for loop and just loop through the URL list. And then every URL in the list directs us toward the State of the Union address for that year, from which we can grab the text, clean it, and then generate sentiment scores. Let's go ahead and play this. The next section here are empty lists, which will be populated. We have one global constant here, the 2025 for the year. And these lists will be populated with the sentiment scores and the text itself and the years. Here's the main execution section. I also have a function here, and we import the text blob and AFIN packages. Now, I didn't separate this project into sections for functions and global constants because it's really short code, and I kind of did this on the fly just for fun. So this is our for loop, like I mentioned, and we're looping through the URL list that we just ran. For each URL in that list, we're going to define some text. We're going to visit that URL and grab the text from it. We're going to use beautiful soup. We're going to get text. We're going to tokenize the text, generate a list of words. We're going to put the words in lowercase. We're going to remove some words, the stop words, and we're going to remove some punctuation. We're also going to lematize the words in this text. So sometimes we don't want to lematize words. We may not want to lematize if we want specific groups of words that have some meaning that we want to tease out and maybe identify sentiment scores for. In this case, I'm just generating sentiment for the whole State of the Union address. So I'm not looking at specific phrases or anything like that. So we can lematize. I have a couple words in here I delete. Don't really have to do this. And these words likely have no type of meaning that would be useful for us in generating sentiment. But I put this in here anyway. This is probably left over from past code. And then the final words, we're going to join into a one big unique string, and that's unique string v2. I often use code from previous projects and just copy paste and then adjust the code as needed, which I don't think is that bad of a practice. It's convenient and it's fast, but you do have some extra stuff that you may not really need and you could edit out. Here's the import for text blob and AFIN. Now for examples on how to use text blob and AFIN, you can check out ChatGPT. It's a great resource. Just ask ChatGPT for some examples using them. And the sentiment scores we generate will be bsent and asent. We generate them from the unique string v2 from previous. And then we append the sentiment scores to those empty lists that we defined in the beginning. tblob scores 2, and AFIN scores. If you come up here, you see tblob scores, tblob scores 2, and AFIN scores. We're going to make some data frames, put the sentiment scores in the data frames, and the dates in the data frames as well. Let's go ahead and run this. I haven't ran this yet. Now we're visiting all of those websites, and this is for several years. Go back to, the early 90s it looks like, and this is up to recent. It's visiting those URLs, grabbing the text, cleaning the text, generating sentiment scores with these modules, and then appending those empty lists with the sentiment scores and the dates. Okay, here's the append for the year. It goes into year list. Now, if you look at this, how do I get the years? You see year, this minus, and then equals 1. And that means for every loop in this for loop, we're going to take the previous year and subtract 1 from it. Year is defined as 2025, right? We defined year as 2025 here. So for every URL in URL list, we're taking the year and subtracting 1 from it. And then we're appending year list. And I can do that because the URLs here are in descending order. Okay, so you can see here 2024 is the first year in our URL list. And then the next one, if we have a little slider bar here for this cell, we scroll over, the next year is going to be 2023. The next year, 2022. So these URLs often contain important information for the date. And so year list appends those dates because we started 2025 and I know that the URL list contains URLs in descending order. Okay, so once we get the dates and the sentiment scores appended into these lists, we're going to use the lists to generate data frames. Data frames are going to be useful for creating plots. So I just defined data frame 1 as the data frame here using AFIN scores, and those AFIN scores are going into the column AFIN. Data frame 1 also has 2 more columns for the T-blob scores, and then 1 more column for the date. All right, so we have our sentiment scores in a data frame along with dates. What about the GDP growth? Well, I have that here in a separate Google Sheet, and here's the link. Let's see if we can open this. Well, actually, I set this up. So I have the sheet ID here in the Google Sheet defined with this important information here, with this important information, which is an identifier for the Google Sheet, which contains the GDP growth. Let me go ahead and show you that GDP growth. All right, here it is right here. We have GDP growth in the US. It goes from 1993 to 2024. This is the year 2025. We obviously won't have GDP growth for 2025 yet because we're still in the year, but we do have last year's growth number here. And this is in percent, 2.765%. 2020 was not a great year. I think something happened in 2020, and then 2021 was a great year. So look at this sheet ID. It says 1NAIKLV1PDDRP. The sheet ID is here in the URL, 1NAIKLV1PDDRP. So this string here for sheet ID is being replaced in G Sheet right here for sheet ID. And the sheet name is sheet 1. Here is sheet 1. And data frame 2 will define as G Sheet here. So data frame 2 we define as the CSV file here for G Sheet. This is just reading that Google Sheet. And then we concatenate data frame 1 and data frame 2, the economic growth numbers, and the sentiment scores. And we call it DF1. So again, we're just overwriting DF1. We put the date in a date time format. This is for the plot. We're going to sort by date, and we're going to lag the GDP growth. So create another column here called lagged growth, and that will be our growth data. Here shifted 1 year in the past. Okay, date is a date time variable. Units are in years, and we're shifting 1 year in the past. We're going to generate some standardized scores and then average them together. We have the standardized scores here for AFIN, standardized scores for T-blob. We can just add them together and divide by 2. And that's still in data frame 1, and that's called STD_sent, so standardized sentiment. And this is what we'll use to plot with. Combination of the 2 sentiment scores that have been standardized. Here's the plot. Let's go ahead and run this. Okay, and there we go. We have our plot here. Let's take a look at this plot real quick. We have black and red lines here. The black line will be for the growth, GDP growth, you can see here. And the red line, column 2, be for the sentiment, standardized sentiment index. Now I wanted to show growth and the standardized sentiment in the same plot. To do that, we can put them each on their own axis. So if you check out here, growth is on the first y-axis. The sentiment scores are on the second y-axis. Year, of course, is on the bottom, on the x-axis. And we have some shading in the background. This will be for the different presidential administration. You can get an idea of who is speaking during the State of the Union addresses. This blue section here will be for Barack Obama, the next red section for Trump, the next blue section for Biden. Previous red section here, this is for President Bush, and the blue section here is for President Clinton. So if we look at these, do we see a relationship? And I think we do. The State of the Union addresses deal with the economy and the overall state of the Union, United States of America. How is everything going? How's the economy, etc.? And it appears there is a correlation. We have this huge dip here in 2010 and a corresponding increase in sentiment and GDP growth following that. There's a bit of white noise here. It doesn't seem to be a relationship in the years that follow. But with the introduction of COVID 2020, it seems that the State of the Union address does more closely correspond to GDP growth again. Now, I thought it was interesting that the sentiment from the State of the Union addresses did closely correspond to the GDP growth here in 2010. With this big dip, unemployment was high in 2010. This was following the great financial crisis. Economy was not in great shape, and the State of the Union address did seem to reflect those poor conditions. By contrast, if you look in the times of COVID and after COVID, 2011, 2022, the sentiment from the State of the Union address for each of these years seems a bit understated considering the economic conditions. It is kind of interesting. I wonder why that is. Maybe this was to assure the country. Not really sure. Could be President Biden's typical way of giving a speech. It's not clear to me. But I thought this analysis was rather interesting in any case. Also, 2016 to 2020, it almost appears like an opposite correlation. The GDP growth is rising and the sentiment from these speeches is declining, which I thought was kind of interesting too. In any case, you can see there are lots of opportunities to quantify text and natural language and analyze it. If you're curious about the State of the Union address, what it looks like, let's look at one of them. So I just highlighted this URL and then held Control and left click. This is from govinfo.gov. That's where I got all of these State of the Union addresses. So this one was from 2024. This would have been delivered by President Biden. So the sentiment scores from Biden I mentioned seemed not so sort of dramatic. But if you read this, President Biden was talking about Hitler on the march. War was raging in Europe. He was talking about previous events in U.S. history. We face an unprecedented moment in the history of the Union, with Putin of Russia invading Ukraine. Insurrectionists stormed the Capitol, placed a dagger at the throat of American democracy. So rather stark language here, it seems. But the sentiment here from Biden is rather negative. It's in the negative area here relative to past State of the Union addresses. Maybe not so surprising. In any case, I hope you like this project. If you like this video, go ahead and like and comment below. If you want more projects like this, go ahead and send me a message, comment below. What would you like to see? Let me know, and I'll see you guys. Bye.